The last will Delores Whitfield left behind made her children rich. It also made them furious, because getting the money meant admitting what they did to get it. Nobody in that room yet understood what Delores Whitfield had spent the final years of her life quietly uncovering, or why she had waited until she was gone to finally say it. This is the story of the family who inherited every cent they fought for, and the one sentence that made sure they would never enjoy a dollar of it in peace. Before I take you into that room, do one thing for me. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. I go through every single one, and I respond personally. Then take a second to subscribe, because there's a moment coming in this story that will change everything you think you understand about what people are willing to do for money, and what a mother is willing to do to make sure her children finally answer for it. If you can already feel there's more to this than an ordinary will reading, stay with me, because this story doesn't start in that office. It starts nearly 40 years earlier, in a small furniture workshop that smelled like sawdust and second chances. Delores Whitfield and her husband, Everett, built Whitfield Furniture Company out of a rented warehouse space in the early 1980s, with almost nothing behind them but a handful of tools and a partnership with a young craftsman named Otis Greene, who Everett had known since they were boys. Otis was not simply an employee. He was a founding partner in every sense that mattered. His name on the original handshake agreement that split ownership of the company 3 ways between himself, Everett, and Delores. For the first 15 years, the 3 of them ran that business the way family runs a household, arguing over decisions and forgiving each other by morning, building something none of them could have built alone. Otis had a daughter, Yvonne, born the same year the company finally turned its first real profit, and Delores used to joke that Yvonne was born lucky, arriving right as the Whitfields and the Greenes were finally starting to breathe easy. Reginald and Patrice were still young children themselves when the company was founded, barely old enough to remember a time before the workshop existed, and both of them grew up believing the business had simply always belonged entirely to their parents. The 2 families spent holidays together for years, and Delores often said Otis had more integrity in his little finger than most men she'd ever met in business. Nobody watching those early years, the long hours, the shared meals, the trust between 2 families building something together, could have imagined how it would eventually end, or that the people responsible for ending it were sitting at that same dinner table the whole time, still children, watching everything their parents built and quietly deciding they wanted more of it for themselves one day. Reginald had grown up resenting the way ownership was split 3 even ways, certain that a third of the company belonging to a man outside the family was a mistake his father had simply never corrected, and by the time he graduated he had convinced himself that fixing it counted as protecting his own inheritance rather than taking something that was never his. Reginald was 24 and freshly graduated with a business degree when he first proposed restructuring the company's ownership documents, framing it to his father as a modernization, nothing more than updating outdated paperwork to reflect current tax law. Everett, trusting his son's education and his intentions, signed what he was told to sign without reading every page closely, a decision he would spend the rest of his life regretting in silence had he ever lived long enough to learn what that decision truly cost. Everett's health began failing within the year, and he passed away before Otis's reduced ownership stake was ever discovered, meaning the friendship he died believing was fully intact had already quietly ended without his knowledge. Patrice, only 21 at the time, but already sharp in ways that unsettled people twice her age, helped Reginald quietly file the amended documents that reduced Otis Greene's ownership stake from a full third of the company to a number so small it was easy to erase him from every future conversation about who the business actually belonged to. Otis did not discover what had happened until nearly 2 years later, when a routine audit revealed his name barely appeared on any ownership record at all. By then, the paper trail Reginald and Patrice had built made it nearly impossible to prove intent, and Otis, a proud man who had never once raised his voice at either of them growing up, chose not to drag a grieving widow and her children through a public legal battle so soon after burying the man he had considered a brother. He walked away from the company instead, taking a severance that amounted to a fraction of what he was owed, and he never told his daughter the full truth of what happened, only that it was time for him to move on to something new. Delores, still grieving Everett and leaning heavily on her children to manage the company in the aftermath, was told a different story entirely. Reginald and Patrice explained Otis's sudden departure to her as his own decision, a man tired and ready to retire on his own terms, and Delores, trusting her children the way she had trusted her husband, saw no reason to look any closer at the books herself. For a while, Otis let that version of events stand between them, and he kept visiting Delores as he always had, holidays and birthdays and the occasional Sunday dinner, never once mentioning what had actually happened to his ownership stake. He told himself it was for the sake of the friendship, and maybe a little for Yvonne, who still adored the Whitfields and had no idea anything had changed. But sitting across from a table he no longer had any real stake in, smiling through conversations about a company he had helped build, grew heavier each time, and over the following years his visits grew further apart, his calls shorter, until the distance between the two families became easier for everyone to simply accept as the natural drift of old friends growing older, rather than the quiet wound it actually was. By the time Otis finally stopped answering altogether, changing numbers, and eventually moving away, Delores had long since stopped noticing the absence as anything more than time doing what time does. Delores did not learn the truth herself until years later, when a former employee, guilt-ridden and dying, finally told her everything on his own deathbed. She tried reaching Otis directly within days of hearing it, calling the only number she still had for him, an old cell phone that had been disconnected for years, and writing to the last address she remembered, only to have the letter returned unopened. Otis had moved twice since leaving the company, first to be closer to Yvonne after she started her own family, then again after a health scare, and he had long since stopped expecting to hear from anyone connected to Whitfield Furniture Company at all. Delores spent months trying to track him down through mutual acquaintances who had also lost touch with him, and when those efforts led nowhere, she turned to Marcus Bell instead, no longer trying to reach Otis quietly on her own, but determined to make certain the truth would find its way to him and his daughter one way or another, even if she wasn't the one who got to deliver it herself. By the time Delores herself grew ill, Reginald was 46 years old and running Whitfield Furniture Company as its chief executive, a role he had held for over a decade, with Patrice serving alongside him as head of operations. Together they had grown the company into something far larger than either of their parents had ever imagined, expanding into 3 states and doubling revenue twice over, and they had grown accustomed to speaking about the business and their mother's eventual estate, as though both were already fully theirs. Reginald had already quietly begun discussions about taking the company public, a move Delores had explicitly opposed for years, and Patrice had already picked out the lake house she intended to buy the moment probate cleared. Neither of them ever asked their mother directly what she knew about Otis Greene, and neither of them noticed the quiet, careful way she began meeting privately with Marcus Bell in her final 2 years, always behind a closed door, always followed by Delores emerging with an expression neither of her children thought to read as anything other than the tiredness of old age. On one of those visits, the last winter before she passed, Marcus later recalled Delores sitting across from him for nearly 20 minutes without speaking, turning a single framed photograph over in her hands, an old picture of Everett, Otis, and herself standing in front of the original workshop the week it opened. She finally set it down and told him plainly that she was done protecting her children from the consequences of who they had chosen to become, and that whatever it cost them, she intended to make sure the truth outlived her. They assumed, the way people who have never been made to answer for anything often do, that whatever guilt existed over what happened decades earlier had simply been buried along with their father. They were wrong, and within a matter of minutes, they were going to learn exactly how wrong they had been. Marcus Bell had represented the Whitfield family for over 20 years, and he had never once seen Delores as resolved, as she was the final time they met to finalize the document, now sitting open in front of him. He read through the opening provisions calmly, the standard distributions, the smaller gifts to grandchildren, the donation to the church Delores had attended for 4 decades, and Reginald and Patrice sat through all of it with the practiced patience of people waiting for the part that actually mattered to them. When Marcus finally reached the primary clause concerning the company and the estate's remaining assets, his voice did not change, but the room around him did. The sentence was simple enough that a child could have understood it. and devastating enough that both Reginald and Patrice would later say they heard it 3 times before it actually landed. The full estate, including controlling ownership of Whitfield Furniture Company, would transfer to them only under one condition: that they publicly restore Otis Greene's rightful ownership stake in the company and make full restitution to his family within 90 days. Should they fail to do so, every asset Delores owned, without exception, would pass instead to a foundation established in Otis Greene's name. Reginald asked Marcus to repeat it. Marcus did. Nothing about the sentence changed the second time. If you're still with me right now, I want to know something honestly. Would you have done what Delores did, or would you have simply let it go? I go through every single one. Yvonne Greene was 36 years old, running a small catering business out of a rented commercial kitchen 2 towns over, when she received a call from a law office she had never heard of, asking her to come in at her earliest convenience regarding a matter involving her father. She assumed, at first, that it was some kind of scam, the way so many calls like that turn out to be, and nearly didn't return it. When she finally sat across from Marcus Bell days later, she learned for the first time in her life the actual reason her father had left Whitfield Furniture Company all those years ago, a story he had never once told her in full, choosing instead to let her believe he had simply wanted a change. Yvonne sat in that office for nearly an hour without saying much of anything, turning over decades of memory in her mind. Every quiet moment her father had grown distant when the subject of the Whitfields came up. Every time he changed the conversation whenever Everett's name was mentioned at a funeral or a wedding. She had grown up believing her father simply preferred a quieter life. She now understood he had spent over 20 years protecting her from a truth that would have changed how she saw an entire family she had once considered close to her own. She left that meeting with no idea yet what Dolores's will would actually mean for her. Only the heavy, complicated feeling of finally understanding her own father a little more completely. Reginald's first instinct was to fight the will in probate court, and he said as much within minutes of leaving Marcus Bell's office, already on the phone with a litigation attorney before they had even reached the parking lot. Patrice, more measured but no less furious, spent the following week quietly exploring whether the condition itself could be challenged as unenforceable, consulting no fewer than 3 separate attorneys who each gave her some version of the same answer. The language was airtight, drafted specifically to withstand exactly the kind of challenge she was hoping to mount. Delores, it turned out, had spent 2 full years working with Marcus to make certain her children would have no legal path around what she was asking of them. What ultimately changed Reginald's mind was not the law. It happened at his own dinner table, 3 weeks after he had first threatened to fight the will, when his 16-year-old daughter set down her fork and asked him plainly whether it was true that her grandfather once had a business partner who lost everything because of decisions Reginald made as a young man. The table went quiet. Patrice, who was there that night, later said she watched her brother's face change in a way she had never seen before, something closer to recognition than shock, as though he were hearing the accusation for the first time even though he had lived inside it for over 20 years. Reginald did not answer his daughter that night. He left the table early, and Patrice found him an hour later sitting alone in his car in the driveway, engine off, staring at nothing. He told her, finally, that he had spent so many years telling himself the story of what happened to Otis Greene that he had almost stopped believing it was something he actually did, rather than something that had simply happened, the way weather happens. He spent nearly 3 sleepless weeks turning his daughter's question over before he finally called Marcus Bell himself and asked what it would actually take to make things right, not because the 90 days were nearly gone, though they were, but because he had finally allowed himself to hear the question his mother had been asking him from beyond her own grave. Reginald and Patrice ultimately restored Otis Greene's ownership stake in full, transferring shares equal to what he would have held had the original agreement never been altered, and issued a public statement acknowledging what had happened, something Marcus Bell has said neither of them did easily or without real resistance along the way. Otis, now 74 and long past wanting anything to do with the day-to-day business himself, transferred his restored stake directly to Yvonne, who today sits on the company's board, the first Greene to hold any formal position at Whitfield Furniture Company in over 2 decades. Yvonne has said publicly that she does not consider what happened a happy ending in any simple sense, since nothing can fully return the years her father spent believing he had done something wrong simply by walking away quietly rather than fighting for what he was owed. She has said instead that she considers it something closer to a correction, decades overdue, made possible only because one woman refused to let her own children inherit a fortune built partly on a debt she knew, in her final years, could no longer go unpaid. Delores Whitfield never explained in writing why she waited as long as she did to make things right. Those closest to her have only ever offered one explanation that seems to fit. She spent her whole life believing her children still had time to become the kind of people who would choose to do it themselves, and only wrote that sentence into her once she finally accepted they might not. If this story moved you even a little, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. And if you thought this story was shocking, wait until you hear about the mother her own children underestimated for 30 years, never knowing the quiet woman pouring their coffee was the one who truly built everything they owned. I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching, and I hope this story about a debt finally paid stays with you the way it stayed with me.